Principles of Economics, my complete guide to understanding economics, is now available in hardcover, audiobook, and ebook from Saifedean.com, Amazon, and many more booksellers worldwide. And now I am also teaching a course based on this book on my website, Saifedean.com. Principles of Economics will run the whole academic year, from September to June, and will have a new lecture every 2 weeks, as well as weekly live online discussion seminars open to learners from all over the world and from all walks of life. Whether you're a student, a professional, or a retiree, you are making economic decisions every day, and this course will arm you with the wisdom of centuries of economists to improve your economic decision-making. You'll also get a free book of Principles of Economics if you sign up for the course. Go to Saifedean.com and sign up now.
The Bitcoin Standard podcast is brought to you by Orange Pill app, the Bitcoin-only social network that connects you with high-signal Bitcoiners, events, and now merchants as well. If you're like me and can't stop talking about Bitcoin, you know how challenging it can be to talk to the no-coiners and how nice it is to talk to someone who gets you. With the Orange Pill app, you can find the Bitcoiners near you and they can replace the no-coiners in your life. You can organize events and meetups with local Bitcoiners, and wherever you travel, you can meet up with local Bitcoiners, all while being as anonymous as you like. So if you want to build your local network of Bitcoiners, find a Bitcoin meetup or merchants accepting Bitcoin, head over to orangepillapp.com to sign up, or download the app from the App Store or Google Play Store and send me a DM so we can get connected. This podcast is also brought to you by the Bitcoin Way, your professional Bitcoin IT team offering you personalized, secure, and comprehensive solutions for every step along your Bitcoin journey. The Bitcoin Way offer live concierge service to guide you with your Bitcoin cold storage, running your node, privacy best practices, inheritance planning, corporate strategy, and multi-sig solutions. They don't touch your coins, they guide you through the process of acquiring your coins and securing them. If you'd like to make your setup safer and more reliable, book a consult with them and see what they have to suggest. If you want to give someone the gift of Bitcoin, get them this professional service that will ensure they start off knowing exactly how to manage their coins and not lose them. Go to thebitcoinway.com and start Bitcoining more confidently. Hello. Thank you. Thank you so much for hosting me. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak at the conference. And I'm extremely sorry for being unable to make it. I really, really wanted to make it, and I thought I was going to make it, but it was just not possible. I really, really am very sorry. I regret not being able to make it. The process for the Canadian visa application is extremely time consuming, and I applied with what I thought was plenty of time. And I still thought I should be able to make it and I should be able to get it out, but it was just impossible to get it out in time. And then I just couldn't make my flight. So I'm very sorry about that. And I thank you so much for hosting me today. And for today's talk, I decided I was going to speak about something that I have not discussed before or written about. I could have spoken about the Bitcoin Standard, but I figured, most people in this conference I am probably familiar with it at this point. I could have spoken about my other books, but I thought, you know what, for today, this is going to be a good time to try something new. I know a lot of the Canadian Bitcoiners know a lot of my work and are familiar with it, and I didn't want to repeat the same kind of talks that I've given before. I wanted to go with something new, and it's an idea that had been kicking around in my head for a while, and I think it would be a little bit unpopular to say something like this. But I thought, what the heck, I'm going to make it into a presentation, and we'll see what you guys think. It is a bit of a confession and an admission of error. It is me effectively changing my mind on the question of central banking. Specifically, I think that central banking works. I think the sad thing that I have come to admit is that central banking is something that actually works. And I think this is something pretty controversial for somebody who identifies as an Austrian economist to be saying, because, well, most Austrian economists say central banking is central planning, and central planning shouldn't work. But I think from an Austrian perspective, you can argue that central banks work. Central banks do not suffer from the economic calculation problem because central banks are privately owned. And Once you keep that fact in mind, I think our entire way of thinking of central banking and the failure or success of central banking changes drastically. The problem of socialist central planning is not about incentives. Socialist societies solve the incentive problem effectively with the threat of violence and gulags. When most people think about the problems of central planning, most think of it as an incentive problem. Most people think the real issue is that if you have a socialist economy, then most people just don't want to work. People just want to benefit from other people working, and nobody has an incentive to work. And while there is some element of truth to this, of course, this is not the economic problem with socialism. The economic problem with socialism is due to the fact that socialism cannot calculate because people do not have property rights. So the issue of incentive has been effectively solved in most socialist societies by throwing people in gulags. And so not getting thrown in the gulag is a better motivation than getting rich for getting people to do things. And if you look at the collapse of Soviet economies, it wasn't because of absenteeism. It wasn't because people weren't showing up to their work that their economy collapsed. People were still showing up, but work was not producing anything of value. So the issue is not about incentive. The economic argument, the Misesian argument about the failure of central planning, is not about incentives. It is about property rights. It's also not about size. Large corporations can successfully plan where small governments cannot. So Amazon, for instance, has 1.4 million people working for it, and it serves hundreds of millions of customers around the world. And yet it manages to get toothpaste delivered in all of those places reliably. And so it can perform economic calculation. And the reason for that is because Amazon functions in a system of property rights. It can perform economic calculation. Whereas in economies where property rights are not respected, in which you have a socialist system, nobody's able to perform economic calculation because nobody owns the factors of production. The government owns all of the factories. The government owns all elements of production. And so there is no real market in the factors of production. The government is buying and selling all of those things to itself. And so therefore, it cannot perform economic calculation because it has no real price for everything, because it is the buyer and seller for everything. There is no real price emerging between actors weighing real opportunity costs for their actions. So without property right, there is no market and no prices and no possibility to calculate how to use resources productively. The issue is about property rights. It's not about size, and it is not about incentives. And that is why when property rights exist, resources always have a real opportunity cost to the owner. And so the owner can perform economic calculation. When property rights don't exist, economic calculation fails. And so that's why Estonia cannot be centrally planned. Economic central planning fails in an economy like Estonia, even though it's a tiny country of 1.5 million people. But Amazon can be centrally planned, even with more people than Estonia, because Amazon is a system of property rights. Everything is owned in Amazon. There's an owner everywhere. And so they're able to perform economic calculation. And so the toothpaste gets delivered. It didn't get delivered in Estonia in many cases at the end of communism because there was no property rights. So just because it's a monopoly doesn't mean it cannot calculate. The Austrian critique of central banking treats the central bank like it is a government bureaucracy and treats its failures like they are the failure of socialist calculation. And that's essentially the essence of the Austrian business cycle theory. In Austrian business cycle theory, central planning of capital markets fails. But does it actually really fail in the real world? Well, central banking is not like a potato central planning board. It's more like a taxi medallion system. I think this is a good way of thinking of it. When I used to try and explain why central banking fails, I think there are good metaphors to be found in central planning of economic goods that causes shortages and surpluses. So you could benefit from likening it to something like a potato central planning board. But really, it's more like a taxi medallion system. It's a system that functions in a market economy, just like taxis still run and work. But some people profit from that system at the expense of others. People who have medallions and the people who allocate the medallions are able to benefit from effectively taking money from the drivers and from the riders. The riders pay more, the drivers get paid less. And the people who are sitting on their ass working with these medallions are able to make a profit from it. But because the taxis are still privately owned and customers pay for them on the market, and they still need to buy their cars on the market, and they still need to sell their rides on the market, there is a possibility for economic calculation in this sort of economic system. And I think the same thing applies for central banks. Central banks have a monopoly over banking and money, but they still exist in a system of private property with markets. It's very similar to the taxi medallion system. There's a system of central banks. It's a common thing for people to think that central banks are not privately owned. They are. There are private banks that own them. That's how they work. If you want more details about how it works in the US, read The Creature from Jekyll Island by James Edward Griffin. But the key point is, since there are owners of these banks, and since these banks are privately owned, there exists a system of property rights with markets. It's a market out there. Central banks are private entities in a market. Yes, they have some special monopoly privilege from the government. They're the only ones who can literally make money. It's a monopoly that's been very successful, I would argue. It's really wrong to think of it as a failure, as many Austrians would say. I think it is a very successful monopoly because they are able to perform economic calculation because everything they use has a market with prices. It is a system that functions within a market economy. So all of the actual resources being traded in the monetary economy are largely in a market, where there is trade taking place. And so people are able to weigh these things and give them an opportunity cost and perform economic calculation. So effectively, we need to define success when we talk about central banking by what matters, and that is the incentives of the owners. You are not the owner. If you believe central bank marketing material, then central banking fails because it doesn't really achieve the objectives of fighting inflation and increasing unemployment. If you look at unemployment and inflation, if you try and argue with the way that the government collects the statistics, there's a good case to be made that the central banks aren't meeting their mandates. I mean, since the US dollars come around, since the central bank in the US took over the US dollar, it's lost more than 90% of its value. So therefore, clearly, price stability has not been working out. But that's all irrelevant because we are talking about the capitalist market economy here. We're talking about a private business that has its owners. And whatever they put out in their marketing material is similar to what you would get when you buy your shampoo. You get a beautiful model on the shampoo bottle with beautiful hair, and you think that if you buy that, you're going to get that hair. You're obviously not going to get the model's hair, but the shareholders of the shampoo company are going to make a buck from putting that beautiful model there. And so all of this talk about inflation and unemployment and your feelings and all of that stuff is just marketing. It's like the beautiful model on the shampoo bottle. Don't kid yourself. It's not really happening. This is a private institution that has owners. So if you measure its success in terms of the benefits it offers to its owners, it's been incredibly successful. Central banking is a real success story. Fiat currencies increased around 14% per year over 60 years. In the Fiat Standard, I discussed this in detail. I ran the numbers on the major fiat currencies and the minor fiat currencies over a 60-year period from 1960 until 2020 and got to an average of 14%. And that includes everything from the US dollar and euro and Swiss franc and yen, all the way to the hyperinflationary currencies that had 100%, 200%, 300% annual supply growth in many cases. You average all of that up and you get a 14% average growth supply in the supply rate for 5 years, which means that in 5 years, pretty much the money loses half of its value on average. The average fiat user loses half of his wealth to central banking in 5 years, which is pretty successful. Think about it. I mean, as a central bank, you're able to harvest half of what people own in the form of cash in 5 years. And that's practically all of humanity being robbed for central banks, local and international central banks and their owners. So the taxi medallion system works great for the owners of the medallions, and the banking system works great for the owners of the banking medallions. Now, here you may argue, well, but the value of the currency goes down, and that's bad. Well, maybe it's bad for you, but you are not the owner of the currency. The owners are the biggest borrowers, and they benefit from the devaluation of the currency. The more that the currency devalues, the lower their debts go. Most of these major corporations and the richest people, they do not hold a lot of cash. They hold hard assets and they borrow and they benefit from inflation. And so, of course, government as well benefits from inflation. So that also helps. And then you could say, well, okay, but central banks sometimes fail. Well, no. Hyperinflation isn't really failure for the central bank owners. They get their debts wiped out and they start the Ponzi again and can buy out everyone who is broke, because generally these people have hard assets. And so you can't really say it is that terrible in many cases, although of course in many cases it does result in the destruction of the central bank, or at least its replacement or its drastic replacement by foreigners or other people. But yeah, sure. But, regular businesses fail too. And if you think about central banking as a business, yeah, of course, you're going to get failures, just like restaurants fail, everything fails. But for the most part, they've done a pretty good job of satisfying their shareholders. And that's ultimately what it is about. And so central banking isn't working. Central banking isn't broken. Central banking is working perfectly. It's a monopoly that benefits its owners at the expense of its users. It benefits them by taking their purchasing power. So maybe we should stop worrying about the collapse of central banking, and thinking more about the fact that it is a sustainable thing that is going to continue like this and what it means for you. But what it means for you is very clear. What it means for you is that you are going to continue to be robbed if you're holding on to cash. And so therefore you need to invest. And so for most people thinking, well, okay, that's fine. We can invest and so we can beat inflation. But if you could beat inflation with investment reliably, then there would be no point to inflation. The whole point of inflation is that some of your purchasing power needs to be taken for the government. And you're not going to magically create more growth just because you are robbing people of their purchasing power, contrary to what the Keynesians would like to believe. And we're not going to get into that now, obviously. But if a majority of customers can beat the casino, there would be no casino left. And fiat is a giant casino. Fiat markets, because the money is being constantly robbed, everybody needs to get out into the casino of the fiat market. And in this giant casino, you may win, but the odds of winning obviously are less than 100%. Or I would say the expected return is less than the value that you put in. So the expected return for me would be negative. And so therefore, and the reason for that is that somebody needs to pay for the house. If the majority of customers of a casino were making money, they wouldn't be able to keep the lights on in the casino. They would have to shut down. And similarly with the fiat central banking system, if everybody could beat inflation, then they're not going to be doing well in business. And in fact, if you look around, you can't really see people beating inflation quite reliably. If you look at over the last 5 years or over the last 10 years, you see that most markets have underperformed inflation, and very few people are able to beat
inflation repeatedly. Of course, the biggest suckers are holders of treasuries. So US treasuries have performed abysmally. Canadian long-term bonds have performed abysmally as well, -1% over the last 5 years, or 3.9%, 4% over the last 10 years. Still abysmal, but surprisingly enough, even better than the US bonds. That's how bad it's been in that fiat republic. Real estate can barely beat inflation. This is thinking of it 6 or 8%. This still doesn't include all the amount of expenses that you need to incur with real estate. So this is a lot less. Gold can't really regularly beat inflation. The S&P 500 and NASDAQ more or less maybe beat inflation when you factor in taxes and capital gains taxes and fees. Then you're cutting it very close. There is only one way out, and that is Bitcoin. And that's the way to understand what's going on. Stop worrying about it, central banking failing. Stop worrying about it not working. Central banking is working perfectly fine. Just find your own way out. And that way out is through Bitcoin. Thank you. Thank you so much for giving me the time. And I am very, very sorry for not being able to make it. And I really hope to be able to see you next year in this conference. I promise you I will be trying my best to make it. Thank you very much.
The syllabus for my new online economics course, Principles of Economics, is now available on Saifedean.com. The course will take place over 18 lectures, each based on one chapter from my new book, Principles of Economics, which will be available for free as an ebook for everyone registering for the course. Lectures will be released once every 2 weeks on Mondays, starting on the 25th of September 2023, and will be available in video and audio format. Live discussion seminars will be held once a week on Thursdays at alternating time slots, 12 hours apart, to ensure learners can attend from all over the world. I'm happy to announce that I have set up my new publishing house and online bookstore, The Safe House, which will be publishing and delivering the best Bitcoin and Austrian economics books worldwide in hardcover, audiobook, and ebook formats. Go to thesafehouse.com to buy my latest book, Principles of Economics, as well as the Fiat Standard and the Bitcoin Standard. And now I'm also publishing Fiat Food, Matthew Lysiak's amazing investigation into how inflation ruined our diet and health. And I'm also publishing Lynn Alden's Broken Money, her masterful exploration of the failures of the global financial system and how Bitcoin fixes it. This is a Bitcoiner's bookshop, so the books are printed in beautiful cloth hardcover made to last, with an ice-colored dust jacket on top. Go to thesafehouse.com and get yours now.
Give it up for Saif, and here he is, in the flesh. Well, in the virtual flesh. We do have a roaming microphone going around right now. If you do have any burning questions to ask Mr. Saifedean Ammous, then please do. Just a second. You need more mics. Yes, sir. Here you are, Mr. Plate. There you go. 2, sure. Do you have a question? Please raise your hand, and we'll bring you a microphone. Likewise in the gods. Oh, there's a question here for the gentleman in the middle aisle, right in front of you. There he is. Just keep talking, they'll eventually pick you up on the... Keep talking.
My question comes from, I come from a different world, I come from the finance world. So my question is related to we talked about debt to GDP ratios. So I believe, as well as many others, that you're going to have a convergence of 2 incoming technologies, robotics and AI, which will create an unlimited labor pool, therefore, theoretically, unlimited economic output. Now, GDPs could increase at a massive level because of, again, an unlimited labor pool. One of the main tenets, and again, I'm not an expert at all on Bitcoin, but one of my concerns is debt to GDP ratios right now are out of control and increasing rapidly. However, once GDP starts increasing rapidly, those ratios change substantially. How exactly does that affect Bitcoin? Thank you.
Thanks. So I don't think you could really say that it is unlimited increase in output. There's going to be an increase in productivity. It's not clear how big it is, but we're still going to have a thing called productivity. There's still going to be not infinite productivity. And so, yeah, GDP might go up because of all of this technological improvement, and that might help bring debt to GDP levels down. But ultimately, there's still going to be devaluation. So even in the best case scenario, there will be a rise in productivity that's going to prevent the loss of value of purchasing power from being so severe. But there's still going to be loss of purchasing power because they're still going to be devaluing the currency because they're still going to be making more of it. So even if the prices of things drop because of the because of the increases in productivity, the prices of things will drop a lot less than they would have if you had had a money that does not suck. And so that ultimately is what it comes down to, that even if there is no disaster scenario, and in my presentation I was saying that there might not be a disaster scenario. They pulled a rabbit out of the hat for the last 100 years. Maybe they can manage another 100 years. So maybe there won't be. Maybe there will be a productivity increase, or maybe there will be just more of this gradual devaluation. But ultimately, you're still being robbed because you would be benefiting from all of this technological innovation if it wasn't for the inflation. And secondly, you're still protecting yourself from getting robbed by Bitcoin.
Question. I think that answers your question, yeah? You satisfied?
Hello, hello.
Super. Thumbs up.
We have a follow-up question from the top deck.
Great.
Yes, hi. It's following up with this same question here. My question is, money is used, the common denominator essentially is paying for time, for goods and services. So following up with this question, when these AI systems come into place and humanoid robotics, and the cost of time goes closer and closer towards zero, minus the capex required for these humanoid robots or the investment in building your technology to streamline and automate your workflows, what then happens to money? So this whole story of Bitcoin, what becomes the purpose of money 50 years from now, 40 years from now? And
yeah, I think one good way of thinking of this is that we are today already in a world in which, compared to, say, the world of 5,000 years ago, we're already in a world in which costs have gone to zero. The price of everything is practically zero compared to what it was like 5,000 years ago. 5,000 years ago, if you wanted to move things around, you had to carry them. People didn't have, well, maybe at least some parts of the world, they didn't have wheels, they didn't have any kind of sophisticated machines that could move things around, or simple machines even. And so things were a lot more expensive. You spent an entire day moving a small amount of agricultural product a few 100 meters around, and that's all you could do. So compared to that, today, everything is already gone to zero. Thinking about just how much productivity increases have happened since the wheel and all of these incredible technological innovations that have happened since then. So I don't see why the next decade or century will be any different. Even with the most optimistic projections of productivity increases because of AI, it's just going to be more productivity, which means more output per unit of input. But there's still going to be a ratio of output to input. And all of the economic ideas that apply in the context of economizing are still going to be there, because ultimately the real scarcity, the real thing that we economize, as I discuss in my latest book, Principles of Economics, is human time. And so your time is scarce. And so even if you can get 1,000 times more productivity, your time is still scarce. And so you can produce more things, but there's only so much stuff that you can enjoy. You want to enjoy your life. And so your time being spent productive is limited, it's scarce. And so the productivity that you get out of it is a good thing. And so what's going to happen is that effectively prices of things are going to continue to go down. But, of course, that only applies if your money does not suck. If your money was not built to rob you. If your money was built to rob you, then tough titties.
So, yes, we have another question from the top deck.
Hey, Saif, really appreciated the talk. Just wanted to kind of pin back on your chart. And we all know gold's historical significance when it comes to its monetary premium throughout 5,000 plus years of history. Were you at all surprised seeing that gold didn't keep pace with the 14% inflation rate, and what was your take on that, given its relative scarcity to, say, equities, which did match closer to that rate?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I'd say 10 years ago, I would have been a real gold bug, even though I was still into Bitcoin. I was still getting into Bitcoin and I was becoming familiar with Bitcoin. At that time, I was still pretty much a gold bug, and Bitcoin was still this very experimental, interesting thing that is not gold, obviously, and gold is the real deal. So I would have been a lot more surprised 10 years ago than I am now. But since the last 10 years, gold's almost practically been flat since 2011, which is 13 years. And so the dollar has been devalued massively. So if you look at the prices of things, I think my favorite measure of price increases is to look at the price of your dream house, figure out where you want to live, the kind of house you want to live in what neighborhood, and what city. And think about what's happening to the price of that house over time. I think that's the most meaningful measure of price increases for you individually, because your house is probably going to be the single biggest expense that you will incur in your life. And so if you're saving up for a house of your dreams, the price of that house is going to be going up and increasing. So gold has not kept up with that. And I just think, I've come to more and more understand why that happens, and I think the Fiat Standard is the culmination of my ideas of why gold has failed to take off. And I would say the answer ultimately comes down to the fact that there is no independent market for the clearance of gold internationally outside of banks and central banks and the fiat mafia. And so the fiat mafia has essentially succeeded in neutering gold's monetary role because they won't let you set up a gold central bank and a gold clearance mechanism. You can't. I mean, you can't just say, we're going to set up a new bank in Canada that doesn't deal with any of the Canadian government's money, and we're just going to use gold, and we're going to ship gold to other countries and trade with them, and anybody's free to join us and do this. You cannot do that, and people who have tried to do that have no fun stories to report on what happened to them. So you can stop the clearance of gold, and then if you do that, gold stops working as money, because in this kind of world, money needs to travel, and it needs to travel very fast because goods are traveling really fast. And so gold just can't keep up because governments neuter it. And so I think it's, it sucks because it would be better if we were on a gold standard than on a fiat standard, but it's why we have Bitcoin. That's why Bitcoin is, in my opinion, such a big deal, because it fixes that flaw, because you could still have a market for clearance of Bitcoin with, even if it was only just 500,000 transactions a day, you could still have 500,000 transactions a day, whether governments want it or not, whether governments legalize it or not, it can still continue to operate and people can run it from all over the world. So I think that's why Bitcoin can monetize, and it can capture all of this pent-up monetary demand, which gold cannot do. And I think the second part of it is that gold is already a $10 trillion or so market. So even if gold does become the world's money, it's going to do what, a 5x, 10x? I mean, that's kind of play for Bitcoin. Bitcoin's going from zero to becoming the world's money is going to involve billions of X's along the way. And we've already had most of these, but there's still a lot more left than gold. So that creates more of an incentive for people to buy into Bitcoin rather than into gold, because the upside is potentially much larger. So I think because of that, because of those two reasons, I think it's becoming less and less surprising for me.
Are there any more questions? Yes, on the ground floor this time, yeah? Fantastic. Man in the blue shirt. Question coming your way, Saif.
Hey, Saif. Appreciate you being here. I'm certain I know your
not.
answer. Well,
Sorry.
virtually anyway. But
Yeah.
I'm certain I know your answer. But in an effort to kind of expand the minds of the people in this room and perhaps reinforce my strategy, I've been in Bitcoin since 2012 and been through all the bull and bear markets. Got into real estate pretty heavily, and it helped me get into Bitcoin. in a decent way. Well, I'm at a point where, it's pretty predictable with the bear and bull cycles. I'm at this bull run at the peak. I've never sold any of my Bitcoin, but I'd like to get heavily into a real estate, a couple deals, and allow myself in the bear market to come to buy back in a pretty heavy way, and at the same time getting pretty much a free hard asset. So, I mean, your mindset's like, just hold the Bitcoin, right? I mean, why would you do that? But it's pretty predictable with the market, so I'm like, take the free asset and get myself some more Bitcoin in the end, or like, what would you do in that case?
It's a difficult question because obviously there's always the fear that you're not going to call it correctly. And I think even though we can see these patterns continue to repeat, I think the last bull market was a pretty good lesson, because even though it was generally a huge increase, there were a lot of ups and downs on the way. So you could have been long Bitcoin with leverage, say, in early 2021 and still gotten wrecked when it crashed from 60 to 30 or something like that. Even though you had the general thesis right, there's so much volatility that it can get you wrecked. And so you want to be careful about that. But I would say, I guess one thing that I try to think of, and I sometimes tell people this, is that better than trying to time the market is try and base things based on your own finances. And so that can end up protecting you from aping all in at the time when the price is very high. Just because if you have these kind of mental guidelines for saying, if the amount of money that I have in Bitcoin is this much, then I'm going to sell a part of it to buy a house, then that sort of milestone is most likely going to be reached during one of these massive spikes, right? So if you have a big milestone in mind, it's going to eventually get reached in these kind of like the big spikes. And then that is usually the time when everybody's being the most bull-targeted. And it's good to maybe plan for that by protecting yourself, because at that point where everybody's posting on Twitter, everybody's dunking on the no-coiners and the shit-coiners, and that's the time when usually it turns out to be the worst time to buy. So perhaps if you were to think of it in terms of your own needs, I think it would minimize the likelihood of regret, because the way to think of it is this. So once the size of your Bitcoin stash reaches a certain amount, then it makes sense for you. Think about it objectively before the euphoria of the bull market comes along and you think, no, let's not sell something, let's go all in and 10x the leverage. If, think of it objectively, at what amount of Bitcoin would I be willing to give up a percentage of Bitcoin to buy the house that I really want to buy? So this is your dream house, you might be able to save up for it. If you're able to sell, say, X% of your stack and get your dream house, then maybe that's something that you should consider. And then if you reach that milestone, then yeah, there comes a point where you're obviously going to be selling your Bitcoin, because ultimately you need other things in life. Contrary to what the kingdom believe, people need to consume every day. So we need to eat, we need to have shelter, and your need for those things increases the less you have them, and your need for Bitcoin decreases the more you have of it. So the marginal utility of Bitcoin declines the more Bitcoin you stack, and the marginal utility of owning your own house goes up the more homeless you are. And so over time, it makes more sense to, get a roof over your head and sell 1% of your stack maybe.
Any more questions in the house, or should we wrap it up there? I think we're going to wrap it up there. Thank you so much, Saifedean. Really appreciate your time. Everyone is cheering, everyone is whooping.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you so much. See you here next year.
I hope so.
Awesome.
I hope so. Cheers.